À toutes et à tous, je déclare.
Good afternoon. I'd like to call this meeting to order and welcome to meeting number 78 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order Thursday, June 23rd, 2022, pursuant to the Order of Reference Thursday, June 1st, 2023. Today we're beginning consideration of Bill C-42, an Act to amend the Canada Business Corporations Act and to make consequential and related amendments to other acts. I would like to welcome our witnesses today. The Honourable Minister Champagne, Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, who's back at our committee again, and he's accompanied today by Mark Shan, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategy and Innovation Policy Sector. Thank you for being with us. So without further ado, I will give you the floor for a generous 5 minutes. Thank you very much, and thank you, dear colleagues. First of all, Chair, I would like to express that I'm thinking about the people of Clova and the riding in the north of La Mauricie, where their village is up in flames, so my thoughts are very much with them today. It's a real pleasure to come before the committee to talk about Bill C-42, and you can see there's Mark Shan with me today, who will be with you for the next hour to answer more detailed questions.
Is committed to a robust and effective regime that will combat money laundering and tax evasion, improve Canadians' trust in the marketplace, and make Canada a leader in corporate transparency. And I'm pleased to note, Mr. Chair, I think that what I've heard is that in principle, all the parties are in agreement that this is the way forward for the country. I think that Canadians who are watching us today would agree that creating a free, public, and searchable registry of beneficial owners of federally regulated Canadian corporations will increase corporate accountability and improve public trust in corporate institutions. Je suis ravi que tous les partis d'opposition.
So I am delighted that all the opposition parties support the principle underlining BC-42, and I'm convinced that thanks to our discussions and the committee's discussions with experts, that we will be able to find a consensual path forward together. So on this matter, I thought that I would use the limited time allocated to me today to underline certain features of this bill that could be of particular interest for the members of this committee. The first thing that I would like to mention is that the amendments proposed in this Bill C-42 are based on the amendments made to the Canada Business Corporations Act, the CBCA in English, amendments that were made in 2018, 2019 and in 2022. Corporations already collect information on their beneficial owners, and what we want to do today is to make sure that we can increase the amount of information that's collected and possibly published. We want to make sure that this information is sent to the government and that a limited and reasonable portion of this information is published for the sake of transparency. The definition of control in the CBCA, the famous 25% that I know that members of the committee have already discussed on several occasions and that you've also raised in the House, flow from these previous amendments and are fully aligned with the Canadian Anti-Money Laundering Act and also the registers adopted throughout the world, in particular in the UK, in the European Union, the United States, and even in Quebec.
Proposed in Bill C-42 will require the CBCA Corporation to collect and send additional information about their individuals of significant control, namely residential address and citizenship. Bill C-42 will also require that Corporations Canada make publicly available a portion of this information. It is important to note that individuals will continue to have the option to provide an address for service, and that when they do so, it is that latter address that will be made public. Citizenship, like the date of birth, will be available to law enforcement, but not made public, notably to protect the privacy of Canadians and to prevent fraud and discrimination. The bill also introduces an exemption regime for certain at-risk individuals. These exemptions are required to ensure our regime is charter compliant. They are targeted and, importantly, limited to public disclosure. I want to be clear to all Canadians watching today that law enforcement will have full access to all the data collected. Le projet de loi.
The bill also contains very strict provisions on compliance, sanctions in cases of simple non-compliance, which could be due to ignorance or a sincere oversight, for example, are in line with other sanctions of this kind stipulated in the Canada Business Corporations Act. However, sanctions in the case of intentional non-compliance, and I'd like to insist on the fact that it's intentional, for example, to cover up other crimes, will be amongst the strictest in the world. The bill also stipulates that there will be effective administrative sanctions and protection for whistleblowers.
The government has committed to making the beneficial ownership registry searchable, scalable, to allow access to beneficial ownership's data, which are held by provinces and territories that agree to participate. And in that vein, I'm happy to report to this committee that the Minister of Finance and I wrote to the Minister of Finance of provinces and territories this morning, asking them to join in this big endeavor so that we can cover as many corporations in Canada. We have a long history of pan-Canadian collaboration on beneficial ownership transparency, on which we are looking to build to maximize coverage and ensure the registry reaches its full potential. We will notably do so through the adoption of an international data standard that will facilitate interoperability. Monsieur le Président,
Chair, thank you very much. And now I'm available to answer the questions from my colleagues and, of course, to proceed as quickly as possible to adopt this bill. Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister.
On Bill C-42, I'll turn it over to Mr. Viss for 6 minutes.
I know I'm sorry, a little confusing here.
The floor is yours, Mr. Viss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, and thank you for being here today. I read over your speech during question period today, and you did reference interoperability with the provinces quite regularly in that speech where we debated each other. What I'm concerned about, and this was not just my concern, but I know members of the Liberal Party raised it as well, is you mentioned as well just today that you're asking for the provinces to opt in. Are there tools available at the federal level where we could compel provinces and territories to participate in a pan-Canadian registry?
first of all, I want to say thank you for the question because you're right. That is very key. As you know, there's about 500,000 corporations under the Canadian Business Corporation Act, which represent about, 15% of all corporations operating in Canada. So the objective we have is to have a free, publicly available, and searchable pan-Canadian beneficial ownership registry. The way we have approached it for now, let me just say for now, is to write to colleagues across the country. Quebec, as you know, has already put their registry in place, I think, as of March of this year, British Columbia. And based on past practices in terms of beneficial ownership, it seems that colleagues around the country would be willing to join in that big endeavor because I think that should be the ultimate objective.
Thank you. One of the questions that came up quite regularly during the debate related to the threshold comment that you made. As we all know that under the amendments to the CBCA under this bill, only an individual or a corporation with 25% of significant interest in a corporation would be covered. Given that we all acknowledge money laundering being a problem, and given that there's only 500,000 corporations incorporated under the federal government, would it not be beneficial to consider amendments to lower the threshold of significant interest for the purposes of having more corporations covered under the legislation to improve Canada's capabilities to fight money laundering?
That's a very good question, and I want to say thank you to my honourable colleague because that's something that I even paused myself when we presented that. The reason why we went with 25% is because that's the threshold that we have in law for money laundering and also financing, combating financing of terrorism. So that's the one thing. The second thing I would say, which is probably more relevant, is that if we want to ensure interoperability with other jurisdictions around the world, there's about, if my memory serves me well, there's north of 120 jurisdictions around the world which have agreed to have beneficial registries. So what we decided was to meet and exceed the standards which have been put by the Financial Action Task Force of the G20. And the reason is that if you change the threshold, if one jurisdiction does that, then you can compare the data because it's not going to be comparable with other jurisdictions. So I think on balance, to be consistent with the laws that we have in Canada on money laundering and combating financing of terrorism, and also to be in line with the international standard, we decided that 25% was the right threshold. Otherwise, the issue we would be the only jurisdiction which would have a different threshold. And, and I just say, for the record, it's quite important for people when you're going to search foreign ownership, you want to have something that you can compare Apple with Apple. If we start changing domestically the threshold, it's not going to be it's not going to be comparable with other jurisdictions in their own beneficial registry.
Okay, I'll look into that a little further. I see your point, but I still think that there's something more we can do because what I'm concerned about is stacked corporations, is people going around the 25% threshold through the arrangements of their businesses. So I just think, given the 500,000. Only 500,000 businesses are covered under the Federal Business Act. We can be doing more, and the effectiveness of this registry will largely, therefore, fall upon provinces to opt in, but we have no guarantee that provinces are going to opt in as of right now. So that's the gray area, I think, as to whether this bill will actually be effective in combating money laundering, in my opinion. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have remaining? Okay. My next question.
Do you want me to comment on that, or
in 30
briefly,
seconds or less?
Yeah. I would say I think there's an inclination of provinces to follow suit, and on the 25%, even if corporations were to stack, I would say that the obligation on the directors and officer of the company is to identify the individual of significant control, so a natural person. So even if you're stacking to various shell company, you still have a positive obligation under Canadian law to identify who's the physical person who ultimately is the beneficial owner of the company.
Okay. In my province of British Columbia, it's like we have the Vancouver model. Money laundering is a real and serious threat. The provincial government has put forward numerous commissions, which have been referenced in the House of Commons during this debate. I'm wondering, in respect to citizenship requirements, whether we could consider an amendment where all corporations under the CBCA are owned by a foreign individual, a non-Canadian citizen, that information be made available or be reported as well as a possible amendment.
We did look at the BC model, and I want to thank you because the BC also looked at the land registry in terms of beneficial ownership, and I think that's a very good initiative, by the way. I would say with respect to citizenship, there's two things that comes to mind. One around dual citizenship, and as you know, that could create issues. The second one would be, as you've seen with the European Court of Justice, which struck down the beneficial ownership registry publication, at least in Europe, we had to make sure that we strike the right balance with the charter so that on one end, the information with respect to citizenship and birth rate will be available to law enforcement, but the name and address will be available to the public.
Do we need to be concerned about the charter and its implications for non-Canadian citizens, though?
Well, I would say that it's a matter of balance. And when you look at the European Court of Justice decision, we don't want to fall in that. To your point, it's been so much. I think Canadians want so much that we try to strike the right balance so that on one end, if you're a bad actor, law enforcement will get access to all of that. So we'll find you. But in terms of public disclosure, we thought that the balance to make sure that we don't have a challenge under the Charter of Freedom and Rights, that this was the right balance that we struck. So available to law enforcement, but what we made public is the address and the name of the I would say the individual of significant control.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Viss. We'll go to Mr. Van Bynen for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to have you attend the committee again, Mr. Minister. We've heard about what we're trying to accomplish, but we haven't talked about why. Why are we putting this bill forward now to this extent?
Well, I want to say thank you to my esteemed colleague. I mean, there's probably three things that we're trying to achieve. The first one is to dissuade the use of corporation to hide assets. And certainly, I think those who engage in illicit activities, whether money laundering, terrorist financing, or tax evasion, should be concerned because we're going to put light on, the type of corporation they may try to use in order to achieve that. The second thing is to improve, I would say, the tracing and freezing of financial assets. There's more legislation that calls for us to take action, for example, to combat terrorism. And I think that having that, just the fact that I would think north of 120 countries in the world have agreed to put such registries, just telling that the world is going in one direction. And we want to make sure that Canada is at the forefront and leading, because we were one of the few nations who created the Financial Action Task Force of the G20. And third one, I think, is to improve corporate accountability and to make sure that Canadians would have trust when they're dealing with corporate institutions. So I think that for me, dissuade the use of corporation, improving trust, improving also the tracing and freezing of financial assets where we need to do so. And I would say more generally for Canadians watching us, for Canadians to be able to search online who owns that particular company, I think that would be relevant. And I would say, since the vast majority of corporations of small and medium-sized companies, what we're asking them is not going to be a lot of burden, because they already have annual report where they already collect a number of information. What we're asking them to add to that is to make sure that they already collected the names and the date of birth. Now they'll have to provide residential address and citizenship. So on one end, we're improving transparency. On the other end, we're very mindful that the vast majority of all businesses in Canada are law-abiding. So this is really to target kind of the bad actors and making sure that those bad actors, we would have more information, we can identify and go after them to the extent that they would be breaching any law. But I would think that for the vast majority of Canadian corporations, small and medium-sized businesses, this is not like an extra burden. They already do the annual report, and they already have to report when they have a change in directorship. So I would say it's really balanced. And I think we want to make sure that Canada stands out in the world as one of these countries which is really making sure that we have all the tools available to dissuade money laundering, terrorist financing, and tax evasion. And I think this is going to go a long way towards that.
You mentioned that there's 500,000 Canadian corporations, and we're in conversations here as well, is that for it to be really effective, we need to engage the provinces.
Yeah.
So can you speak to me a little more about the scalability of this registry?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think colleagues have alluded to that. What is really, really crucial, and one of the things we did is that we have adopted what we call the Beneficial Ownership Data Standard. So that's a standard across the country, so to make sure that our registry would be interoperable with the one in British Columbia, the one in Quebec, and also that the data that would be collecting would also be consistent with the Financial Action Task Force of the G20. So you see, there's a lot of value going back to the stacking issue and foreign ownership that some colleagues have pointed out. You want to make sure that the registry we have, first, that other provinces and territory can jump in, and eventually could cover, for example, trust. I think there might be a question, what about trust and other form of incorporation? Obviously, this is dealing with Canadian Business Corporation. We all know that trust is under provincial jurisdiction. But the day that the province would, for example, adopt legislation in that regard, that could be added to the registry of beneficial ownership. So it's an open source kind of a framework to make sure that the more we do together, the more information will be available, and that it's also going to be publicly searchable. So I think there's a lot of benefit, first, to align with international standards, going back to the 25% that the colleague raised, but at the same time that we have the Beneficial Ownership Data Standard, which is really something that is going to help and make sure that whoever has a registry in Canada will have something which is interoperable. Because at the end of the day, what you want, and that's the final objective, is to have a pan-Canadian beneficial ownership registry where you have all the information. So CRA, other law enforcement agencies, banks, journalists, Parliament, everyone could go and search on that, and if there's things to identify, people would have the information.
Mr. Chair?
45 seconds.
45 seconds. Very quickly then, what kind of measures will the government put into place to ensure compliance and the accuracy of the registry?
Well, first, I would say, going back to the fine issue, there's a $5,000 statutory fine. And why people would say, is that the cost of doing business? I would say no. That is similar to any other form of non-compliance under the Act. But that could be for an act or an omission, that is not willful. But when you're talking about willfully, providing false information, you're up to 200,000 to 6 months in jails for directors and officers. That is among the most stringent, I would say, penalties you find in the world. So like I said, you keep the 5,000 for someone who could omit it, let's say in good faith, to report something. But if someone does something willfully, they're exposing themselves to jail. That, for me, is the hammer. And that's why we are best in class, I think, in that, if you look at other jurisdictions around the world.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Lemire, la parole est à vous.
Over to you, Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here, and thank you for your opening remarks. And I have talked about your village that's been affected. We are in a similar situation at BTB de Miscamingue, so I would also like to offer my solidarity and support to people in this village, in particular forestry workers. It's an economic sector that's very much under threat currently. And I'd like to reiterate our invitation to have another meeting with you on the supplementary budget 2022, 2023, 2024. We always enjoy seeing you for that. So turning now to Bill C-42, there's going to be good social and environmental responsibility regime for the business corporations. They'll need to take into account ESG factors, and we're trying to encourage them to have a long-term vision and make a positive contribution to society in general, as well as achieving profits. So there's positive effects for the Bloc Québécois. And you've taken on board a recommendation to have more transparency and more accountability for shareholders, and you've reinforced the responsibility of the members of the boards of administration. So I wanted to underline these points. But there's some other elements where there are still questions without answers. So perhaps you could clarify this. For example, if a corporation A belongs to Corporation B that belongs to Corporation C, can we find out who's the actual beneficial owner, who's taking the decisions, who is the true leader with this type of business decision? If this corporation is in a country that's less cooperative than Canada, where there's no automatic sharing of information, for example, with a tax haven, with Bill C-42, can we identify the true owner of a corporation that has assets in Canada? The easy answer is yes. There's a positive obligation on the directors and officers of the corporation to identify the ultimate beneficial ownership that holds 25% or more, and it has to be a physical person. The responsibility of the corporation and the directors and the officers of the Canadian corporation is to get that information and disclose it. So there is this positive obligation being created by this bill, positive obligation for directors and officers. That's why I was saying there's the 5,000 fine. For example, if there's administrative error with not filling something out in time, but if somebody willfully decides to provide false or erroneous information, then they could be exposed to 200,000 in terms of a fine or 6 months imprisonment. So it is important because it's the responsibility of the director or the officers themselves to collect this information for those who hold 25% of the capital, even if we have this phenomenon of stacking. Finally, the Canadian officer, the director, has to go and gather this information and disclose it in the register. In research, we have seen that there are certain territories, such as the Malaysian territory Labuan and the British Virgin Islands, where there are strict laws on secrecy, which means that foreign courts cannot get access to information about the true owners of corporations. So these are tax havens that protect themselves. And within these shell companies, where there were transactions with Brazil and US and France, how do these countries actually manage these issues? And how do you manage this issue of these tax havens that are the most stubborn? I think there's 2 points here. First of all, there's a positive obligation towards the directors and officers to take reasonable steps, and case law will have to define how this will be dealt with on a case-by-case specific basis. But as you've said, there's over 100, I think it's 108 countries who've already identified this opportunity of setting up a register for beneficial ownership. So I think we have to work with international cooperation. I was pleasantly surprised to see that there are so many countries that have voluntarily indicated that they wanted to have their own beneficial ownership register. And that leads me back to the question of interoperability. It really is important because in the case that you've mentioned, if you've got more and more jurisdictions that are undertaking this same effort with interoperable databases, and if we're able to search these publicly, then it would be more and more difficult for those who want to hide away to do so. Because if you've got more entities in there and if you've got 128 countries that are in these registers, people will be able to do the cross-referencing. So, of course, there's this positive obligation on directors and officers. And then, secondly, we've got this other phenomenon. It's a bit like the minimum taxation rate, which has been adopted generally throughout the world. So I would say that most countries are going in this direction of having more transparency. That is why it is so important for us to get this bill adopted to show leadership. So we'll have more tools and it'll be more agile to deal with these issues with the technological transition. But there's not a true answer. If people want to act in bad faith, they'll still be able to do that in tax havens. We won't be able to attack that. If you are a director officer of a Canadian corporation, then you can be liable for 6 months imprisonment if you provide erroneous information. So tread carefully because there is this positive obligation now under the legislation which is being imposed on directors and officers. And to come back to what you said on the extraterritorial side of things, if there are still tax havens out there today, I think their existence is threatened with 120 countries in the world who are deciding to set up this type of register. I think their days are numbered. It's going to be more and more difficult for them to continue to exist because if you have more countries with this type of register, then I think it's going to become difficult to maintain this type of tax haven over time because the international community is going in another direction. And it really is essential to have interoperability because if we can compare a register with others and if we want to actually exchange this with another 125 countries, we want it to be clear if we all have the same common basis. That really is essential in this bill. Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire. Minister?
The bells are ringing, so I would need unanimous consent to continue this meeting until 10 minutes before the vote. Do I have unanimous consent for that? And also, I'm just looking around the room. If it's the intention of members to vote electronically, we could also push it a little further and get more time with the ministers. So is that the understanding around the room? Perfect. So, Mr. Fast, the floor is yours. Mr. Massé, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. And thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here. As we're talking about corporations and accountability, I want to first ask if the Minister can update us with regards to Stellantis in Windsor. I'm not shaving until we get a deal, and you can see I'm starting to get pretty rough here. So can you perhaps give us a little bit of an indication as to what's taking place? Obviously, there's a lot of interest, not only just in my community, but also Essex County and across Ontario and Canada.
That's a very good question, Mr. Chair, and I'm very happy, and I think you'll have the opportunity to shave in a not-too-distant future. But I would say what you have seen unfolding is us trying to get the best possible deal for our workers, for the auto industry, and for Canada. And I can tell you that the negotiations with the company are progressing, and that I'll be happy to keep you updated as things unfold. But you appreciate these negotiations are complex. They are sometimes difficult, but as you coming from the auto sector, I would say, Mr. Massé, you know that at the end, I remain very confident that we'll get to the right place for everyone. But for now, you know, the discussions are progressing, and I think you've seen these things going on and on. We've been in the auto sector for decades now. So I would just say to everyone, take a deep breath. Negotiations are ongoing. For us, it's kind of a day-to-day activities to negotiate with these companies because there's many companies who want to come to Canada to build batteries, to build the EV ecosystem of the future, not only in Ontario, but in Quebec. And so my job is to make sure we get the best possible deal for all of us.
Well, I do want to, before I get into questions there, I do want to acknowledge your hard work on the file and appreciate keeping us up as high as possible. And I still want to advocate for a national auto policy that's a little bit more detailed. But at any rate, I do want to acknowledge your hard work on this.
Thank you, sir.
And this in particular. Moving to this issue right here, I do want to go back to the $5,000 fine. And I understand what you're saying, that jail or that, but that's like to prosecute, litigate, charge, all that, that's a big public expense. Why would we not increase the fine on that? I mean, if we're going to, I think sending things to the court system, it should be the last resort.
Sure.
And if this fines is up to $5,000, why not increase that to at least reflect the basic costs, and what has there been costing is what would it actually cost the Canadian government to litigate somebody through that process?
Well, I'm quite happy to answer that, because I think, particularly coming from the NDP, you would probably agree with me, is that if you look at the vast majority, the real vast majority of Canadian corporations will comply and will provide, the information that is needed to maintain the integrity of the system. So one reason that I come from a small and medium-sized family business, and, sometimes there could be an honest mistake made, and you don't want to penalize, someone who would be a small business by having a fine which would be disproportionate. On the other end, you want to have the big hammer. If someone willfully provide false information, now you want to have the big hammer and say, well, in your case, you did something which is illegal. We'll go after you. You'll pay up to $200,000 or 6 months in jail. But when we did this kind of balance, I also had in mind the smaller guys who, could do an honest mistake. And at some stage, $5,000 for a lot of small corporations, as you know, in Canada, that's a lot of money. So we need to keep the small guy in mind and just make sure that if it's an honest mistake, well, they'll pay a fine of $5,000, and the bad guys may go in jail for up to 6 months.
Yeah, I know, and I appreciate that, but I mean, it's up to $5,000, so the decision could be reflective of that anyways. It could be $500 if somebody does some type of administrative, and you're right, we don't want to go after the small thing. And by the way, when this came up about 8 years ago, the NDP actually had these amendments that were voted against our amendments that are actually here today. So we're very encouraged to see this come forward and want to see it get done really quick, and hopefully this session. But if it's, again, it seems to be like, I don't want to be argumentative, but it's up to $5,000. So I understand it now. They could set like your case that you mentioned there, a small business, maybe it's $500 that they pay. But why not for these larger corporations have like flexibility so that they can go up to like actually recovering? Because if not, if they have to 6 months in jail as the hammer to come down, it's going to cost the taxpayers. And maybe I can ask our analysts to find out how much it would cost to prosecute a case like this. I'm just curious if I don't know if we could even find that out, but I'm willing to bet it's more than $5,000. So we end up paying anyways. Yeah.
I think, again, and we can agree to disagree on the philosophy, but the thing was that for like an administrative mistake, let's make sure the threshold for the smaller companies, which, a vast majority of Canadian company would be small and medium, and for the bad actor, which is really when someone does something willfully, that there you have the big hammer. I think, and I appreciate where you're coming from, and I want to applaud the work of the NDP and your work, Mr. Massa in particular. You've done a lot of work on that. But if you ask me philosophically where we came from, was really to say honest mistake, $5,000. It's consistent with what you find in the law in the Canadian Business Corporation Act. But if someone willfully does something, there you take the big hammer, because I think, I've asked the department, but I think this would be amongst the strongest penalties you find in the world. So you really want to punish the bad guys and somehow make sure that since it's the vast majority of Canadian corporations will never have to deal with that in terms of fines, you want to make sure that, you protect the small guy with a fine that still would be significant for a small business of $5,000.
This bill right now in its context does enough to be oversight with lawyers and accountants, because that's where primarily the tools for money laundering are right now. Is it strong enough, in your opinion, for lawyers and accountants to be accessible and also, part of this review?
Well, we have a section where they call that cross-reference. Some other, as we amend other laws, will have to, like banks, for example, if they were to find a material difference in their records, and the one in the registry would have to notify us. So I think there's a number of systems in place to make sure of the integrity of the registry and to make sure that we could detect that discrepancy, and we'll have like a risk-based system to make sure that we can investigate, to make sure that the information in the registry is accurate and reliable. So, and I think, part of the regs as well is to say, there was some question also whether the power which was given under the law to adopt regulation. I say, well, that's to keep up with the international standards, because today we're talking about date of birth, citizenship, but maybe 2 years from now, people will find out, to your point, that we should collect another piece of information, because as you know, the bad guys always try to outsmart us. So we have to have the flexibility in the law to say, this law is going to be there for long, but let's make sure that in regs, if the international standard move, we're going to move with the international standard to make sure that we capture that and make the life of bad guys as difficult as it can be.
I'm running out of time, Mr. Chair, but I want to say that I'm really interested in getting this through as quickly as possible. I mean, I've been pushing fraud issues for a long time, and this is part of these repertoire changes that are important. So thank you for tabling this bill.
I want to thank the member and Chair. I know unanimous consent is not something you find often in this House, but if there was a way to move that faster, I think Canadians would applaud us in moving forward on that.
Well, we find it quite often here in this committee, Mr. Champagne, and appreciate the willingness of Mr. Massé to move quickly. That's music to my ears on this bill. So, Mr. Fast, or Mr. Généreux this time. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, Minister. Quick answer, quick question, quick answer. What's happening with Quebec in terms of the matching up with the register? Because we have got our equivalent register. So how are you going to match up this bill with the Légif in Quebec, which is our Quebec corporate register? Are there going to be certain amendments that will have to be made in Quebec as well to match this up as with British Columbia so that it can be interoperable? Well, as far as I know, that's one of the key issues as to why we're tackling it in this way. I believe that this proposed regime will be interoperable with the Quebec Register without any modifications. That's how I've understood it. So from the very outset, we had the beneficial ownership data standard, a standard for all of the provinces and territories, and what we're proposing is compatible with what we already have in Quebec and BC. Now, initially, setting up this register should have been taking place in 2025. I think you want to do that earlier. What's the main reason? I suppose it's to ensure that we can catch the so-called bad guys. Are there certain groups that are opposed to this? Is there any public opposition to this bill? We had some consultations, but we hope that we can get that set up before the end of 2023. That's why we hope we can move quickly with the members of the committee. The reason for this is that we want to show leadership within the G20 on this matter, namely combating money laundering and terrorist financing. So we have had consultations, and Mark can tell you more about that, but I believe that we've consulted with around 80 organizations across the country, and it seemed that most people in general were in favor of this because the register that we're proposing is interoperable, and secondly, it's tracking the standards that have been set up with the OECD and the G20, so we're very much aligned with international standards. We're meeting and even going above and beyond the international criteria that have been set for lawyers and accountants. It's the international standards, so I think that we're in the right position to be a world leader. Is there a budget that's been analysed to see how much it's going to cost to run this register? Because I remember that we were saying that it was going to be $2 million for register, and then it turned into $2 billion. Well, Mr. Généreux, we used an organisation that's already within my department. We've given them an additional budget because perhaps you will recall that, first of all, we were talking about having a directory where people would feed in the information, but now Canadian corporations will also have to have agents who are able to ensure the integrity of the information being provided and have investigative power. So we needed to have more powers in the department. But as far as I remember, we're not talking about that scale of funding. There's structures that are already there. We're changing the IT tool to make it compatible, and there'll be certain officials that will ensure the integrity of the data. I'd like to come back to a question that was put forward by analysts on 2.2 of C42. It changes 21.1 of the Canada Business Corporations Act so that a director appointed under the legislation can determine the information that they want to receive amongst the information listed here rather than receiving all of the information that's covered in the register. But under 21.1 of the Act, talks about certain changes that have not entered into force. So it seems that perhaps there's been no order in Council to allow for Section 30 of the Budget Implementation Act, where there's 431, where they would allow for a new amendment on the CBCA. So when 2121, when is it going to enter into force? And why is C42 changing provisions that have not yet entered into force under the BIA? Well, that is a very good question, Mr. Généreux. Perhaps we can answer that in writing, because we'll understand that as Minister, I perhaps don't have all of the information to give you the most specific answer and all of that, in particular when it comes to entry into force of certain provisions. Well, basically, there's going to be an amendment to a provision that's not yet entered into force, where it seems to be putting things in the wrong order. Well, as you put forward that question, the officials have heard it, and I'm sure that in the next hour there are certain officials who will be able to answer this or come back with a written answer. I thought you were the keeper of all knowledge. Well, it's great to think that I know everything, but at my age, that's fine for me. That's it. Thank you very much, Mr. Généreux. And now, Madame Lapointe. Thank you very much, Chair.
Today with my colleague MP McKinnon. Minister Champagne.
Minister Champagne, it's a real pleasure to have you amongst us today. So what are the new obligations for businesses, and how is the government going to limit the administrative burden imposed on corporations? Thank you, Madame Lapointe. It's always great to come before the committee. There's two new pieces of information that will need to be provided. Corporations were already collecting information on the name of the beneficial owner, of course, and the date of birth. With this legislation, they have to collect two additional pieces of information, namely the residential address or the address for the service of documents when we communicate information to the corporation, and secondly, information on citizenship. And two will be rendered public, namely the name and the address will be rendered public and can be made accessible to the public via a database that can be consulted by the public. Then secondly, when we talk about citizenship and the date of birth, that will not be made public. It will be made available to different agents and officials who have to ensure that the law is actually being respected and enforced. And I think we've struck a good balance here, because with the CBCA today, corporations already have to file an annual report, and they already have to inform Canada corporations within 15 days if there's a change of director within their corporation. So as people already have to do this annual report, we've thought that the entry in force will track the date. It's done on an annual basis, so it will follow the date of corporation. There won't be an additional burden. Basically, at the next date after the entry into force of the bill, people will have to collect these two additional pieces of information. And for the vast majority of Canadian corporations who are SMEs, we haven't really added an additional burden. We wanted it to be a light burden, but what we have in the register will allow us to identify those who want to be involved in illicit illegal activity. So I think we've struck the right balance there. Could you explain for the committee how this proposed regime draws on national and international best practices? Well, thank you for that question. Canada has followed what's happened in Quebec and British Columbia. They've already showed leadership in this area. And with this proposed register, we're following best practices internationally established by the G20. So with a register, it's going to be comparable with what we have in the US, in Europe, and Japan, and in the UK. So we've tracked the best practices, and we've gone above and beyond these, because Canada was a founding member of the Financial Action Task Force. We were one of the founding members of the FATF. So once again, we've shown leadership in Canada. So that's why we turned to our colleagues in provinces and territories to get going on this as well, because British Columbia and Quebec had already done that, and we sent out a letter together with the Minister of Finance to ask them to do this. We've been working on that since 2017, in fact. We've been working on these questions of beneficial ownership since then. So I think they're going to take this step forward so that we can get this pan-Canadian register on beneficial ownership up and running.
Thank you, Minister, for being here today. So as a former IT professional, I'm already building this in my head. I'm wondering about the search capability, and I'd like to build on what Mr. Viz said and Mr. Lemire. The complexity of corporate ownership can be quite vast. They can involve companies owning companies which own themselves. I'm wondering if this public search tool will be able to drill down through that kind of structure and, in fact, accrue the actual beneficial ownership per person through that whole structure.
Yeah, one of the things which is interesting is that some people have compared that, for example, what you find in securities laws. But this is about natural person. So the positive obligation on the directors and officer of the corporation is to identify the ultimate beneficial owner of what we have said, the individual of significant control. That needs to be a natural person. So whether people are stacking, or to the question before, using different shell company or registered in a trust or other things, it is incumbent upon the directors and officer to publish, or let's say to provide the information about the beneficial owner, which is a natural person. So if you're going, to your point, to different corporation, at the end of the day, there needs to be a natural person where you identify which has more than 25% of ownership of the company. I think that is the main difference, because I truly understand what you mean. As a lawyer, I can see why this registry is so important, because as you know, under securities law, you need to list people who own more than 10%, whether it's a legal person. But this is about beneficial ownership, and the name you put needs to be a natural person. So in terms of searchability, you'll be able to search the name of that person. So if you wanted to know if any individual would own any company, you would be able to put the name of that person, save for the fact that there would be a minor under 18 which has exemption, or people which would be exempted for security reasons. But otherwise, their name would be searchable in the database. I think that's the powerful tool for banks, for law enforcement agencies, for anyone who's concerned about providing or making sure we have integrity in the system.
Carrying on with that, so with these stacked companies, if you will, they may have officers and directors who themselves are not necessarily, they probably are shareholders of those other companies, but they may be appointed by people. So it seems to me they would have an influence on the behavior of the company that their company owns part of. So is there a mechanism, or is it relevant to be tracking the directors and officers of the companies that own a given company?
Well, first of all,
brief answer, please, Minister.
Sorry?
A brief answer. Please.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, we'll make sure we verify the person providing the information. And I would say for the officer and director of the Canadian corporation, which is subject to the law, they have a positive obligation. So it's upon them to provide the accurate information. So you see, and that's why I was saying to Mr. Massé before, why it's so relevant is that if as a director or officer of a Canadian company is subject to the law, you willfully provide information which is false, well, you're exposing yourself to 6 months in jail. So the onus is on the director and officer of the Canadian corporation to provide the accurate information about the beneficial owner of the company.
Thank you very much. Merci, Monsieur Lemire.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Chair. Now, on money laundering, could you tell us more about the offences and the additional powers with the register. Do you think these corporations will be able to respect these different deadlines? I think yes, because we've said that this bill will enter into force on an annual basis. We're going to take the date of corporation to impose this obligation. It won't be the same date for everyone. There will be a date of entry into force, but it will cover off all of this in the annual report, and that's when they will have to provide this additional information. And as you've said, other people in the financial system will then have access to that information and will be able to alert us if ever we find erroneous information somewhere, to make sure that the register has data with integrity, so we'll be able to search via corporation, see whether it's entertainment or sporting bets and so on. Well, as far as I know, I think it's going to be on the basis of the name provided, the name of the corporation and the name of the beneficial owner. Perhaps later we will be able to carry out searches in different ways within the database. But in order for it to be interoperable, we have to make sure that what we're doing is in line with what's already happening in Quebec or other parts of Canada. So that's the basis for the moment. So Quebec created its beneficial ownership register in February 2020, and it was adopted in June 2020, or rather in December 2020. With Bill C-42, there are provisions to create this beneficial ownership register and render it public. How will it be able to get up and running, and it will be difficult for provinces to actually work with this register? Are there going to be any gaps and shortfalls? Well, we've worked with the Quebec government on this, and often the Quebec government has shown leadership. So as far as I know, the idea is to go for interoperability. That was the crucial issue. And I think now that with BC and Quebec and adopting this at the federal level, we've created the right momentum for other provinces and territories to come on board. And with a pan-Canadian register, there will be lots of advantages. That's why it's important to make sure it's interoperable. And then there's the question of data. Why are we restricting ourselves to just publishing a certain portion of information or just collect some information? It's to make sure it's interoperable, because if people decide to do things differently, then it wouldn't be interoperable. So we're tracking the best international standards, and that's why the platform is going to be similar between the federal level and what's happening in Quebec. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Massey now.
Just to continue with that, in the United States, how do we compare with them in this process? It's one of our biggest, obviously, trading partner. And
well, we think the biggest difference that I'm aware of, Mr. Massey, is that their registry will not be publicly available.
Right.
And that is a policy choice for our friends in the United States. Their registry will be available to law enforcement uniquely. We made the choice in Canada, like other jurisdictions, the UK and other jurisdictions, to make it publicly available. And that's something that we've heard as well through consultation, that people wanted that. And I think it provides, I think we one of the tenets of what we do is about transparency. And I think having a registry which is publicly searchable is of benefit to Canadians.
Yeah, I agree, and I actually commend the legislation for that, because I think it's obviously with our system of electoral politics versus theirs, them getting a public register is probably impossible, not related to practical elements, more political elements with campaign financing, quite frankly, knowing this from experience and that over there. So that's all the end of my questions, Mr. Oh, one last quick one. Is the Senate is prepared for this bill if we're able to move this quickly through the House? Any discussions going on there? Thank you.
I think so. I think my sense, at least, is that the Senate is as enthusiastic as the House is, and that's why I would say, Mr. Chair, I know you've been able to do great things in the past. If we could get the unanimous consents to move that along, I think the only ones who are going to benefit is Canadians at the end of the day, and it will allow us to show that we lead internationally as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Now, as you see, members, we're reaching the vote, so we'll have to suspend briefly, and as soon as the vote is over, we'll come back for the second hour with officials. Thank you, Mr. Champagne. Thank you, Minister. Yes, we're done with you. Yeah. Okay, meeting suspended.
Not for an hour, but for your question.
we're good to resume this meeting on Bill C-42, and thank you for your patience and apologies for this suspension. This is the kind of thing that happens at this time of the year in Parliament. So we now have the officials with us to answer your questions. I understand that there are no preliminary remarks, given that the Minister has done that already. So we're now to the Conservatives with, I believe, Mr. Viss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of follow-up questions from the last round. A comment to start. It seems that positive obligation on behalf of corporations and the individuals running those corporations is where we're going to see where I see the most vulnerability in this legislation. And what comes to mind as well in the context of positive obligation and putting all of that on individuals or corporations is that corporations under the bill are only liable for a summary conviction to a fine not exceeding $5,000. Why the discrepancy between the $200,000 fine for an individual, but an individual working under a corporation is only subject to $5,000?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I think it's actually important to understand. So the individual is not actually exempt from the $200,000 fine if they're working under the corporation. What we need to make a distinction of is between the fine that's levied against the corporation itself versus the officers and directors of that corporation. And so in cases where there's actually contraventions of the Act, there's the possibility of a $5,000 fine against the corporation, which in many cases is actually either assetless or potentially able to dissolve quite quickly, or and I should say, the opportunity to be able to come at the officers and directors of that corporation for the contravention of the Act, and they have a penalty of up to $200,000 and 6 months in jail. So in the kind of routing out of bad behavior by corporations, the corporation itself is in itself not a natural person. And so going at the corporation with stiff penalties when they have the capacity to either dissolve or otherwise is not necessarily seen as efficacious. Whereas going at the individuals who are behind those corporations, even when they dissolve, is the effective way of ensuring that they actually come into compliance.
Thank you, that's helpful. The Minister referenced, in respect to our conversation on thresholds, the need for this bill to be, and subsequently the Act, to be in line with the Terrorism and Financing Act, Money Laundering, I don't know.
Proceeds of Money Laundering,
Proceeds of Crime and Money
Financing.
Laundering,
Yeah.
Terrorism Financing Act, yes. Under that law, I believe that there's, especially in my province, there's general understanding that law is not strong enough to and has not led to enough convictions for money laundering and other white-collar crimes. So if we're adopting the standard under that bill of a 25% threshold, are we not limiting our ability to really get at the heart of money laundering and white-collar crime in Canada?
Yeah, I'll actually pair your first question with your second, because I think it's important to kind of look at it holistically, which is we're adding tools to the overall toolkit of kind of coming at white-collar crime, including terrorist financing and money laundering. So the 25% standard is the standard that's been adopted internationally, and it's the standard, as noted, that's already in the Proceeds of Money Laundering, Crime and Terrorist Financing Act. This is a belt and suspenders mechanism by which essentially organizations and corporations, when they enter into financial arrangements with their financial institutions, are obligated to provide their beneficial ownership information to their financial institution. By also then subsequently providing it to Corporations Canada, we're adding yet another mechanism by which law enforcement can continue to discrepancy understand and look for organizations that are potentially not actually holding up to their transparency obligations. You add to that efforts that my colleagues at the Department of Finance are far better able to speak to, which is the evolution of the Proceeds of Money Laundering, Crime and Terrorist Financing Act and the evolution of FINTRAC. And I think what we're adding to here is one very important kind of toolkit, particularly then when we look at the international kind of collaboration, which is that we will essentially be joining the world in having a beneficial ownership standard using both the code and the same threshold.
I think all parties agree that the applicability of this bill, if passed into law, will largely be dependent on the participation of provincial and territorial jurisdictions. The Minister indicated he wrote a letter today in his opening comments, but so far we do not have any assurances, despite the minister's best wishes, and despite, I think, the best wishes of Canadians and even some provinces, that there will be full participation and that a beneficial ownership registry will, in fact, be pan-Canadian. The minister alluded to in his comments that we'll see this as a first step, and then we'll see after that what provinces may opt in. So, according to that comment, what time frame has the department set to reach agreements with provinces and territories for their possible participation under this bill, if passed?
So, Mr. Chair, if you'll permit me, I'll just back up slightly and say this has been an ongoing multi-year journey with the provinces and territories to increase the overall transparency of ownership information related to corporations. Obviously, incorporation in Canada is a split jurisdiction. You're able to incorporate either provincially or territorially or federally, and it's not for us to be able to dictate that corporations have to incorporate in one place or another. That said, since the very beginning of this process, we started by getting agreement with all of the ministers of finance of the provinces, territories, and the federal government first to ban bearer shares, and second, to actually collect beneficial ownership information at the level of the corporation. We then got a secondary agreement from all of the provinces, territories, and the federal government to ensure that there was lawful access to that information at the place of situ, which is the corporate headquarters. We are now then we've consulted with the provinces and territories about the beneficial ownership registry portion of that. There's no deadline set at this point for the beneficial ownership registry portion of that, but so far, we've gotten concurrence with Step 1, which was holding the information, Step 2, which was getting law enforcement access to it in situ, and now we are advancing Step 3, which is the holding of the registry and actually making it public, and we are committed to working with the provinces and territories on Step 3.
One final quick question, Mr. Chair, is that okay? Okay, thank you. One of the registries that has been talked about during the debate and referenced in our chamber is the UK registry. One thing that's happened in the UK as it relates to exemptions is that celebrities or wealthy people, it's very easy to get an exemption to access the information on a public registry. So what assurances can the department provide Canadians that this, in fact, will be a rigorous registry? And will there be a set of published guidelines for possible exemptions? And who will ultimately make that decision?
The ultimate determiner of the exemption will be the Director of Corporations Canada, who currently has the possession already to be able to make exemptions for other aspects of the Canada Business Corporations Act. The only automatic exemption is for those persons under the age of 18 for the protection of their privacy. The other exemptions will be required, and what we do imagine under that is potentially blind trusts, because it defeats the purpose of a blind trust if you actually can publish the information related to it. But the director will need to make public on an annual basis in their annual report how many exemptions they've actually provided.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Viss. Monsieur Longfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Viss. Now, Mr. Longfield.
Great to see you again. It was the 42nd Parliament that I was on Indu, and it's good to see some of my colleagues around the table from that time as well. We talked back in those days, a few parliaments ago, this came up from time to time. We looked at the money laundering in particular and the exposure Canada has to actors from other countries coming in and taking advantage of Canadian laws, which at the time weren't as strong as what we are now making them. Thinking about how the regulations work with the Act, the PCMLTFR, the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Regulations, and how those regulations would be improved on by using this Act, and maybe what happens to those regulations following this Act being enacted.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question, and I appreciate being back at Indu again. So the Proceeds of Money Laundering, Crime, and Terrorist Financing Act is the act that essentially binds the financial community around the way in which they help root out money laundering and white-collar crime and various other aspects. The regulations have an important crosswalk over to the beneficial ownership transparency provisions of the Canada Business Corporations Act as proposed, in part because essentially we're asking for similar information under the two statutes. One, under a regulatory framework, because it actually requires banks to collect a whole series of different information, and it evolves as we understand the nature of financial transactions. Whereas this will actually be a legislative obligation on corporations under the Canada Business Corporations Act, which we feel comfortable legislating in part because we know distinctly what information we're looking to collect. We've kept ourselves a certain amount of regulatory flexibility to add to it over time, but essentially by collecting the information at the level of the corporation, and then also at the level through the regulations at the level of the financial institution, we allow for those discrepancies to emerge, and we allow for law enforcement to have yet another kind of element by which they can start to piece together all of these different kind of aspects to get at the ultimate what money launderer or white collar crime.
Is there a mechanism for which this act could then retroactively look at corporations that might have been suspect under CRA investigation? Or how would this be looked at going forward once the act is in place?
So there are two verification mechanisms that are imagined under the course of the act. Well, more than two, but two substantive kind of crosswalk ones. One is, as noted, we do have a regulatory to be determined obligation under the Proceeds of Money Laundering, Crime and Terrorist Financing Act for discrepancy reporting, which will look across the two. And there's also a modest feedback loop between our information and that of the Canada Revenue Agency, simply to allow for things like whether or not there's obvious discrepancies between the information that was filed under the Beneficial Ownership Registry and that's been provided to CRA. It's a ping system essentially, so it's not a transfer of information necessarily. It's a mechanism by which the Corporations Canada can have early detection in some ways. At this stage, it's not imagined to pool all of that data. That's a further consideration that I think is for down the road as we continue to evolve our overall posture with relationship to money laundering and terrorist financing.
CRA in particular, since 2015, we've invested a lot of money in collecting offshore taxes that were due to the Government of Canada that we hadn't been collecting. They've been tightening the web or the net around the offshore activities that are tax avoidance, illegal tax avoidance. When you couple with this act, it seems like we're going to be really tightening up in terms of how companies wanting to have illegal ways of laundering money outside the country as well as inside the country being addressed through this act.
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways you can look at it. On the one hand, we've got a number of organizations now that are adding to their toolkit with respect to the routing out of this noxious behavior. Second, we have capacity for some of those systems to in minimal ways speak to one another. And then we've got the international cooperation by using the standard and having more and more countries adopt this that essentially starts to make it increasingly challenging and ideally very inconvenient to try and be in the business of money laundering.
Great, thank you. And then finally, I've just got about 45 seconds. I'm thinking of how we disseminate this information out. I've been on the board of a few companies, and we have fiduciary responsibilities that we generally find out through our auditors and through accounting firms. Have we been engaging with auditors and accounting firms in terms of being able to roll this information out to boards of directors?
We've consulted quite widely, including transparency organizations, lawyers and accountants, the corporate community, including small businesses, and we also imagine quite a robust outreach capacity to ensure that people understand these obligations as they come into force, because an individuals of significant control registry isn't necessarily something that's obvious to every single business owner. So.
Thank you. As always, great answers. I appreciate it.
Many thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Longfield. Monsieur, avant de passer la parole.
Before I give the floor to Mr. Lemire, I need unanimous consent from the committee so that we can continue to 10 minutes before the vote. Do we have unanimous consent to continue to the bells ring out? So over to you then, Mr. Lemire. Thank you. I was trying to assess how much time I would have to be fair to my colleague Brian. So, first of all, thank you very much for being here. What is the current figure in terms of money laundering in Canada? Because there's a cost if we don't act and let things continue. I don't know. I don't know if I've got an exact figure. There's lots of different estimates about the cost of money laundering activities, but I don't have an exact figure. I could possibly provide that to the committee. So does C-42 have real teeth to deal with what we've seen in the past, such as the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers? Could we have avoided that type of scandal by using what we have in Bill C-42? Bill C-42 gives us another tool for enforcement agents to counter money laundering activities and terrorist financing. It's not a silver bullet, but it is another tool. It gives us information and another mechanism to verify and make sure that this corporation is actually providing this information as obliged to do so, and perhaps combine that information together with other sources of information to really combat money laundering and terrorist financing. I've seen that the lack of transparency leads to fraud and money laundering, and for the government, this idea of achieving transparency is to fight against these ills, or do you think it's more of a laissez-aller approach? Now, could you perhaps repeat the end of the question? Is it a priority for the government to achieve transparency? Because according to me, that would mean it'd be fighting against crime thanks to transparency. Is that part of the thinking of the government? With this bill and the changes that started back in 2018, there were around certain amendments so that bit by bit and stage by stage, we could have a higher capacity to counter money laundering. And I think that shows the government's priority to fight against this. It also includes priorities such as changing the legislation, such as the PCMLT-FA. I don't know what it is in French. Thank you. So when fighting against tax havens, have we got FTAs with a country that could be described as a tax haven? And with Bill C-42, do we have a way of negotiating these FTAs again to make sure that this now becomes a criterion for a Canadian corporation to deal with a so-called less cooperative country? With this bill, C-42, well, in fact, the aim is different with trade agreements. Generally, it's an agreement between governments about taxes and free trade between corporations. But with this bill, we're dealing with corporations and officers and directors. And they have a positive obligation to name the human being at the end of the chain. And this includes people outside of Canada, including foreign countries, where there's perhaps a lack of transparency. There's an obligation that has to be shouldered by the directors and officers of the corporation. And so this is a different angle compared to what we're pursuing with a free trade agreement or a tax treaty. For example, if somebody's based in Jersey or on a tropical island, those directors have the same obligations. If they've got a link with Canada, they still have to provide that information about the human being at the end of that chain. We know that in Quebec, the right to property falls under the civil code in Quebec. Does that make it more complicated for your department to coordinate and match up all of the legislation for these different enforcement and framework measures? It's not really a complication as such. It's a requirement. In Canada, there's a shared role between the provinces and the federal government when it comes to incorporation. That's why we need to have this type of project, to make sure that we can cover off all of the aspects in the system and ensure we all have the same approach. You're only as good as your weakest link, as we see. Final question. What would happen if C-42 was not adopted? What would be the economic consequences and also the tax consequences? I don't have an exact figure in terms of cost, to come back to your first question, in fact. But there's a reputational cost because Canada is part of an international effort to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. And if Canada doesn't have a register, and if we don't step up our efforts, then that would indicate that Canada is not a part of this international effort. So I think that's a significant reputational cost. There's also cost for the economy because there's the question of the capacity of being able to use corporations to continue with money laundering activities. Thank you very much. And now Mr. Massey.
And no, I'm glad to see these amendments. I hate to say I told you so, but I'm going to say it because some of these things are what were voted against last time. One of the ones, though, that I'm looking at right now in this, and I look at my old notes, was a fight over the fines and penalties again. $200,000, it was talked before, we had pushed for $1 million. $5,000. I mean, these could be like the cost of doing business, and the fraud and the type of pain and suffering this creates. $200,000 is like a slap on the wrist. I mean, that's like not a lot of money. Why wouldn't we tie it to revenue or assets if we wanted to go with the, giving, small businesses? And I guess where I differ is it says up to 5,000, up to 200,000. Where do these numbers come from? I really am interested in that because this committee, we fought before to stop the use of fines and penalties being a tax-deductible write-off. That was one of the first things I fought here before because it was cost of doing business. It hurt not only just the consumers out there, but also other businesses that were doing the right thing. So that's the other part of this argument here is all the other businesses doing the right thing. And so where does a 200,000 come from, and where does a 5,000 come from?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think, again, I'm going to make the important distinction between the fines that are levied against the corporation versus the fines that are actually attributable to the individual directors and officers of the corporation. The $5,000 is consistent with all of the other penalties leveled against the corporation in the Act. It's the consistent fine that we level against corporations for misconduct under the Act. And again, we feel that the ability to render penalties against the corporation is a limited mechanism by which to actually route out the behavior because it again isn't tied to the individuals. $200,000 in individual liability. So again, you can't tie it to revenue because they're not corporations. They're individuals. So when you imagine being a director or an officer of a corporation and potentially being liable for $200,000 of your own money and 6 months in jail of your own time, it actually takes on quite a meaningful potential incentive to ensure that your corporation's actually on the right side of the law.
I guess when you look at, though, the malfeasance that's taken place in white-collar crime, I don't think $200,000 to many people is, that's equivalent now to occupations in general per year in professions. I mean, and I'm sorry, I just don't have much faith in Western democracies treating white-collar crime significant. There's been very few cases where people actually have gone to jail. And if we're going to criminally prosecute somebody, a $5,000 fine, it's going to cost us significantly more to prosecute that. And and if our threats are alone to put people just in the courts, then we're pushing into the court system, which is under stress now. So I guess I'll leave that for this debate. I appreciate where it comes from. At least we understand now. That's my questions, Mr. Speaker, because it's going to be a kind of a political fight, I guess, in some degree. And I appreciate the officials, though, with their information.
And I think we understand it's a political fight you've been waging for a long time, Mr. Massey. So Mr. Longfield was commenting that you have not changed that much over the years, and so consistency is good in politics. So that concludes our round of questions. However, we have a bit more time. So if anyone has more questions, I would just open the floor. Otherwise, we will leave it at that. And I want to, before I let you guys go, I see Mr. Albus. You mind, Mr. Chair? Sure. Yeah. I have a question.
Quick question to officials. So, to me, the implementation of this is going to stem largely from how simple it is for someone to be able to do a search, whether it be under the federal sphere or under the provincial. So has there actually been discussion about the interoperability between provincial and territorial systems? Or are there going to be different programs for different provinces, and you'll need to get a different signing code for each individual province? You're going to have some which will be charging a fee, which raises the point, Mr. Shan, that whether or not the federal government will be charging a fee for access to the registry. And if you don't know, just tell me that, but I'd like to find out how your department views this work in that kind of scheme.
So the commitment has been that the registry will be free and will be searchable. It does two things that are important for the purposes of ease. One is it adopts the beneficial ownership data standard, which is the international standards for the collection of information related to beneficial ownership, which means that the way in which we collect the information is interoperable with the information that's collected by our international counterparts and by provincial counterparts, should they adopt the international standard, which is increasingly common.
I appreciate that there's an international standard. I appreciate that Canada we're trying to align with that. But the question goes, will someone have to go to a different site to access the information, and will they be subject to different provisions provincially than they would be from the federal one?
So each province and territory and the federal government offer the opportunity to incorporate in their province. To date, the two provinces that have adopted beneficial ownership registries basically largely conform to almost the identical kind of capacities in terms of what they actually ask of the individual corporation. They've used the beneficial ownership data standard, and with the exception of very small administrative differences, are basically the same. And we've built the system, or are building the system, with the capacity to ingest and onboard provinces and territories into the system. It's worth noting that there's a precedent for this. So there's a system called MRAS, which is a common front end to all of the corporate registries in the country, that pings the individual back ends of all of the provincial and territorial registries. It was a common project adopted between the provinces, territories, and the federal government. So we've done it before, and the capacity for us to be able to ensure that we have a federal registry that has the capacity, we've built it with that in mind. That's the full intent of the government, is to make this a one-stop shop for beneficial ownership registry information.
So it could have the potential to do that, to have that interoperability where it's a one-stop shop, but yet to be concluded.
The Constitution lets us work with the provinces and territories in the realm of their jurisdiction, which includes the capacity to incorporate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Albas. So just before, first I want to thank the officials with us this evening or afternoon. Much appreciated. Thank you for taking the time. And just before I let you guys go, as you know, on Monday we are next Monday we're doing clause by clause on this precise Bill 42. With your permission, I'd ask additional resources in maybe 1 more hour for the meeting so that we could have a full panel of witnesses and then do clause by clause. I think that would be useful for this committee. So that's okay. That's how I'll proceed. I'm not sure if the House will provide the resources, but I'll ask on behalf of the committee. Perfect. So on that note, thank you, everyone. Meeting adjourned.
Merci.